Bangladeshis will be voting for their MPs and a referendum on reforms on 12th February. Voting for your MP is simple enough, but saying yes or no to the referendum question is quite another matter. Well, first, because you have to understand the question itself. This four-part question is complex, and today we will break it down in parts and explain how to make sense of it. This is part 2 of the referendum explainers. The package of reforms is based on the July Charter. We discussed and explained the July Charter and its process in the last explainer video, which you can watch. The link will be provided in the description box. Coming back to the referendum question, this is a four-part question. A question followed by 4 parts that strive to outline the entire July Charter. Not the entire July Charter per se, because it has some 84 recommendations for reforms. Not all of those recommendations need to be on the referendum because they don't need to change the Constitution. It's only 47 recommendations that need constitutional amendment in order to go through. Those proposals are on the referendum. That is what voters presumably will be asked to say yes or no to, but not in so many words. It's not going to ask, do you approve of the required changes to the Constitution, or do you approve to the July National Charter? It doesn't ask anything like that. The Bengali is quite complicated, and I have a working translation of something that is similar to Bengali. It's I think it's almost comprehensible, since the Bengali is very complex and bureaucratic legalese. That's how they generally tend to be. Now, the question first: do you consent to the July National Charter Implementation Order 2025 and the following proposals related to constitutional reforms mentioned in the July National Charter? Yes or no? So this is not asking whether voters agree to the National Charter itself or the constitutional amendment that will need to happen in order for these recommendations to go through. Instead, it asks voters if they approve or consent to the July National Charter Implementation Order 2025. And then it mentions the following proposals. What follows are 4 paragraphs where the drafters have tried to outline most of the recommendations or measures that will go through, and that voters, at least in their perspective, that voters need to understand or know in order to vote yes or no. Of course, one cannot expect voters to actually read this in the polling booth and then vote. They must be sensitized, and there must be awareness programs before that, so that voters know exactly where to vote before even going to the polling booth. But the question itself now, the July National Charter Implementation Order 2025 is the piece of the official communication. This is the order that outlines what will happen if a yes vote wins, and that is if the referendum goes through. This also has a provision to issue another order, which will then outline how a referendum will be held. Because mind you, right now, the Constitution of Bangladesh does not have any provision for holding a referendum. Hence, the Election Commission, which will be organizing the referendum, and it will be conducting the general election and the referendum. The Election Commission will need to have some sort of document, an order, to go by when they hold the referendum. So the other ordinance, which outlines how the referendum will be held, is this separate document, and it has all the details. So it describes when voting will start, when voting will close, what happens to the ballot boxes, what is a ballot box, who will be the presiding officers, who will be the officials of the referendum, and so on. More or less, everything pretty much coincides with that of the general election. Whoever is conducting the election at a certain place, the presiding officer for the general election will also be the presiding officer for the referendum. The ballot box for the general election will also be the ballot box for the referendum. Voters will have two ballot papers, one for the MP, one for the yes/no referendum vote. They will stuff the ballot papers into the same ballot box. It will be sorted later. All that is mentioned in the ordinance that outlines the referendum. Now, going back to the order which voters will be asked to say yes or no to. This order also outlines steps that the elected parliament will have to take once and if the yes vote wins, if the referendum carries through. We'll talk about that in the next episode. But for now, going back to the question in the following four parts. But this is basically the initial question which is then qualified with the constitutional reforms mentioned in the July Charter. So these are this A, B, C, D. The first one, A, and this is following the question in the beginning. A, the election time caretaker government, the election commission, and other constitutional bodies or institutions will be formed in line with the process outlined in the July Charter. The caretaker government has been a very contentious issue. It was first instituted in Bangladesh through a constitutional amendment in 1996. Before that, we've had an interim government, so a non-partisan government, so to speak. And then we've had elections under caretaker governments. These elections have tended to be better and fairer than the others held under party administrations or political parties, the ones held by political parties. One of the problems with the last three elections was that the Awami League had completely abolished the provision for caretaker governments and went on to hold elections under their administration, which turned out to be grossly unfair. There were allegations of different types in different elections. But in 2006, when BNP had just left office, there was also an attempt to tweak with the caretaker government so that the resulting administration, the caretaker government, would be in BNP's favor. And that didn't quite pan out, which then resulted in a 2-year state of emergency with another military-controlled interim government, followed by Awami League's landslide victory in 2008, end of 2008. So the election time caretaker government and how it will be formed, as outlined in July Charter, is very crucial. That's the first item mentioned. So how is it going to be formed? Let's discuss that just very briefly to give you an idea. Once the term ends, or near the term end of tenure for one government, there will be a selection committee. This selection committee will include the Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, the Speaker, and a Deputy Speaker from the opposition party, and one member of the third largest, or well, the second largest opposition, so the third force. These are the 5 people that will be on the selection committee. These are all from the lower house, by the way. There was a proposal for an upper house. We'll come to that later, but the entire selection committee will be from the lower house. These 5 people will then ask or seek names of potential chief advisors, the head of the election, the head of the caretaker government, from different parties, registered parties, those in parliament or outside parliament, but all registered parties. The selection committee itself will be able to include certain individuals it deems fit. Independent MPs, they will be allowed to provide their names, one name each. So one party or an independent candidate, they get one name one name each. So you have a bunch of names. From this list of names, the 5-member selection panel decides one individual. If they fail to do that, then it goes on to option 2. The second option is the ruling party proposes 5 names. The main opposition proposes 5 names. The second largest opposition proposes 2 names. The ruling party chooses one name from the opposition's list and one from the second largest opposition's list. The opposition also chooses one name from the ruling party's list and one from the second largest opposition. So at most you have 4 individuals at this point. Then the 5-member committee deliberates on the 4 individuals. If they can't arrive at a unanimous vote, then the one with 4 out of 5 votes will be deemed to have become the chief advisor. If that fails, then 2 judges, one High Court judge, one Appellate Division judge, will be invited to join the panel. This will make the panel a 7-member panel, and then they will vote on a ranked choice basis. If that fails, the provisions of the 13th Amendment kicks in, with the exception or condition that the president will not be allowed to become the chief advisor. The president became the head of the caretaker government and took office of the chief advisor. Now here, that is barred. So this is the entire process that is mentioned or outlined in the July Charter. This is the July Charter. Now, it has all the details, it's time bound. However, there is another problem, which is right at the point where it outlines, where it says 2 judges will be invited to join the selection panel. BNP has a note of dissent, and it proposes that the list be sent over to the parliament, where the members vote and choose the chief advisor on the basis of majority. However, here it says will be formed in line with the process outlined in the July Charter. It appears that BNP's notes of dissent in the caretaker government or in the appointment of other constitutional bodies like the Comptroller and Auditor General, Ombudsperson. There are other certain institutions and commissions like, say, the National Human Rights Commission, the head of the Bangladesh Bank, the Bangladesh Energy Regulatory Commission, and so on. The BNP has also issued notes of dissent in the appointment process outlined here, meaning that they oppose the appointment process as outlined in the July Charter. But this provision here, the first point, does not seem to pay heed to it. It does not seem to recognize that there are other exceptions or people who have parties that have dissented, issued notes of dissent. B. The next parliament will be bicameral. A 100-member upper house will be formed in proportion to the votes received by parties in the national parliamentary election. Approval from a majority of the upper house will be required to amend the constitution. So, first, there is an agreement to have a bicameral parliament, a lower house and an upper house. The upper house, it's been proposed, will be called the Senate. Has to be decided perhaps, but the Senate will have 100 members. These 100 members will be chosen on the basis of the share or proportion of votes that each party gets in the national election. So naturally, the parties will have to have a list of 100 nominees who will become their senators depending on their proportion of votes that they get in the national election. And it will follow the sequence of the list, the order of list in that they submit, naturally. So if they have 40% vote, a certain party will get the first 40 of its members on the list in the Senate or the upper chamber. Now, this second point states the fact of the bicameral parliament, the 100-member upper chamber, and the proportional representation matter as if it is already a done deal, as if that is pretty much what is going to happen. That is for sure. C, the parties that win the next parliamentary election will be bound to implement, or one could also read it as the parties that win the next parliamentary election shall implement the 30 proposals agreed upon in the July National Charter, including increasing women's representation in Parliament, electing the Deputy Speaker and several committee chairpersons from the opposition, limiting the Prime Minister's term, enhancing presidential powers, strengthening fundamental rights, ensuring judicial independence, and empowering local government. So this is the one place, the one provision or one instance in the referendum where there seems to be a binding clause by this shall. This is the one item that sort of says that no matter what happens, these things must have to be done in future. And it's almost tying the hands of the future government in a way. It says 30 proposals agreed upon. Why 30 and why not 47? Because these 30, see, here it recognizes the notes of dissent. These 30 are the ones that are said to have passed unanimously, which is not quite the case. If you take increasing women's representation in Parliament, which is the first item mentioned among the specific provisions, some of the specific provisions that was mentioned here, it will show in the July Charter, it clearly states the currently reserved seats for women is 50. Besides that, parties will be required to nominate at least 5% of their total nominees women. So women will have to account for at least 5% of their total number of nominees. From the next election, from the election that follows after the signing of the July National Charter. The July National Charter 2025 has already been signed. This is the election that follows it. In this election, we have about 2,000 candidates, MP candidates, not even 100 are women. So less than 2.5%. All the parties combined, it would be difficult to find anyone which is complying with this, the most minimum of requirements. And this 5% requirement will increase by increments of 5. So in the next election, parties will be required to nominate 10% women and then 15 till they hit 33, which is, according to the July Charter, the ultimate, that's the goal. 33% women candidates as nominees for MP elections. Right now, there are certain parties that have no women candidates at all, and some. And here we see that 3 parties have objected to it. They have issued their notes of dissent, but other parties that have agreed to it are not complying with it either. Now, the parties that have issued their notes of dissent, on one side we have the provisions or the recommendations, on the other side of the July Charter we have numbers, index numbers which correspond to parties, and we see here it's 4, 19 and 23. If you look at the appendix, it will have, so 4 is Islami Andolan Bangladesh, 19 is Bangladesh Khilafat Majlis, and 23 is Bangladesh Nizami Islam Party. These 3 have issued notes of dissent. So they may not have female candidates on their list, but neither do other parties like Jamaat-e-Islami, which has agreed to it in principle but has not nominated a single woman. And it's not like other parties are complying with it. The proportion of nomination is below 5%, as can be seen from the total numbers anyway. This is about just this one thing which says increasing women's representation in Parliament, electing the Deputy Speaker and several committee chairpersons, which is the parliamentary committees. They will some of these parliamentary committees will be headed by members of the opposition. Deputy Speaker will come from the opposition. these have been agreed, and there have been fairly a unanimous agreement on many of these things that have been mentioned here. Also, a limit of the Prime Minister's term, which is 10 years, no matter how many terms. The Prime Minister, an individual, will be allowed to serve as the Prime Minister no more than 10 years in their life. Certain appointments will now come completely under the President's authority. It used to be that the President needed to be advised by the Prime Minister before, and now they won't. It also says strengthening fundamental rights or expanding fundamental rights, which is not quite the case. If we go to the section on fundamental rights, what it says is, this is point 9 of the July Charter. What it says is that parties will ensure that the fundamental rights are expanded and protected, and according to the report of the Consensus Commission. The Consensus Commission was the one that tried to have all the parties come to an agreement. The Consensus Commission's report will have to be consulted, and as outlined there, the parties will try and expand or increase the fundamental rights and strengthen them and protect them as they deem fit or as is appropriate. There is no one specific fundamental right mentioned here. There was a lot of discussion around voting rights, right to internet, because both people had been deprived of both during the Awami League regime, and both of these were considered as to be included in the fundamental rights. In fact, there was an expectation that there would be a Bill of Rights. That would be one section of our Constitution, which didn't really happen later on. And so we have this sort of a vague recommendation, but it in no way expands our rights in any way. But that's what it says in the question. That's what it will say in the question of the referendum itself. Point 4. Other reforms mentioned in the July Charter will be implemented as per the commitments of the political parties. This last point seems to acknowledge the notes of dissent that parties have issued. Because this one says, now, so here are the three things, and whatever is remaining, parties will be allowed to do as they wish, as they have stated or as they have committed, indicated during the discussions of the July Charter. This is the four-part question that voters will be asked to say yes to or no to. There is no multiple choice or multiple answers, so there may be things that voters fully agree with, there may be things that voters completely disagree with, and no matter what, people will be asked to vote yes or no. And also it is important to note, this is not just a constitutional language. It's not quite a certain change, a concrete sentence or two sentences in the Constitution that we are shown or we are being asked to approve or to agree with or disagree with. It's essentially something that will kick off another process. It will be the beginning of another series of actions that will have to go through before the changes actually happen. We'll talk about that in the next episode, where we explain what happens if the referendum passes through.